What would you do if the only home you had ever known was sold out from under you, your legacy reduced to a pittance in an envelope? What if you used that pittance to buy a place no one else wanted, a place of rust and ruin, crowned by a mine elevator that had hung silent at the surface for 80 years? And what if the greatest secret of that place was not what lay at the bottom of the shaft, but why the last car had come up empty? The end of Alara's world was not a dramatic cataclysm, but the quiet, administrative scratch of a fountain pen on a deed of sale. Her stepfather, Marcus, a man whose heart seemed to be made of the same cold, gray ledger stone as his desk, did not even have the decency to look her in the eye. He simply slid a thin envelope across the polished mahogany, the surface a mirror reflecting a distorted version of the life she was about to lose. Inside were $350 and a single sheet of paper informing her that the house, her grandfather's house, was no longer hers. She had 1 week. She did not cry. She did not plead. The grief for her mother, and before that, her grandfather, had already scoured her clean of such displays. What remained was a quiet, hollow space, a resilience forged not in fire, but in the slow, grinding pressure of loss. Her grandfather, Elias, had been a mine surveyor, a master of geology and mechanics. He was a man who believed the world could be understood through precision, through the careful measurement of angles and the patient observation of stress lines in rock and timber. He had taught her to see the world not as a series of emotional upheavals, but as a set of mechanical problems to be solved. From him, she had learned the language of wood grain, the subtle temper of steel, the art of drafting a perfectly balanced schematic. He had taught her how to read the story of a mountain in its strata and the history of a machine in the wear patterns on its gears. Her hands, though slender, were calloused and capable, as comfortable with a dovetail saw as they were with a drafting compass. He had left her with a philosophy of quiet competence, a belief that honest work was a form of prayer, and that self-reliance was the only true fortress against the whims of the world. And he had left her one other thing. From a locked cabinet in his workshop, a place Marcus had never dared to enter, she retrieved its worn leather case. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was the brass surveyor's transit. It was a beautiful instrument, heavy and intricate, its vernier scale and spirit levels promising a world of empirical truth. It was her only tangible link to him, a symbol of his guidance, a tool that measured the world with uncompromising honesty. It was her true inheritance, far more valuable than the house Marcus had so casually discarded. She packed a single canvas satchel. In went a set of her grandfather's smaller tools, a whetstone, a spool of waxed thread, a change of clothes, and a small, leather-bound volume of logarithmic tables. The transit, in its case, was slung over her shoulder. She walked out the front door of the house she had been born in, down the gravel path her grandfather had laid, and did not look back. The $350 felt like a deliberate insult, a final dismissive gesture from a man who had only ever seen her as a loose thread in the tidy fabric of his new life. Her journey was a shedding of a skin she had outgrown. A series of bus rides carried her away from the soft, rolling hills of her childhood and into the hard, angular spine of the continent. The landscape grew harsher with every mile, the trees becoming stunted and tenacious, the rock showing through the thin soil like bone. She got off at the last stop, a forgotten town called Terminus, huddled in the shadow of a mountain range that clawed at the sky. The town was a place of quiet decay. The county clerk's office smelled of dry dust and brittle paper. It was there, pinned to a corkboard yellowed with age, that she saw it, a notice of sale for a derelict mining claim, the Silent Sentinel, to be sold for the exact sum of its unpaid back taxes, $350. The clerk, a man named Henderson with a perpetually skeptical expression, chuckled when she pointed to it. "That old place?" he said, leaning back in his squeaking chair. "Daughter, that's not a mine. It's a grave. Headframe's about to collapse. The main elevator cage has been seized up at the surface since the Depression. They say the last owner, a fellow named Kane, ran off with a fortune, but the car came up empty. Cursed the whole place. He saw the look in her eye, the quiet determination that he mistook for foolishness. You'd be buying a pile of rust and rotten wood. I'll take it, she said, her voice steady. The transaction was a study in condescension. Henderson treated the paperwork as a grand joke, his pen scratching with exaggerated flourish. He took her money, the last of it, and slid the deed across the counter with a smirk, as if he were selling her a piece of the sky. To him, she was a naive girl, throwing away her last few dollars on a local folly. To her, it was the first decision she had ever made that was entirely her own. She was no longer a ward or a tenant. She was a landowner. The thought sent a small, unfamiliar flicker of something like hope through the hollow space inside her. The final leg of the journey was on foot, a 7-mile hike up a barely there trail that switchbacked through dense, silent pine forest. The air grew thin and sharp, smelling of resin and cold stone. As she crested the final ridge, she saw it, and her heart, which she had thought immune to sinking further, plummeted. The clerk had not been exaggerating. He had been kind. The silent sentinel was a skeleton picked clean by wind and time. The headframe, the great gallows-like structure that housed the elevator winch, was a jagged silhouette of rust and silvered, splintered wood against the unforgiving sky. The ancillary buildings, the bunkhouse and smithy, had surrendered to gravity, their roofs caved in, their walls leaning at drunken angles. The entire site was a monument to failure, a testament to the slow, inexorable victory of nature over human ambition. For a long moment, she felt the crushing weight of her decision. The clerk's mocking laughter echoed in her memory. She had traded a home for a ruin. But then her grandfather's voice, a low and patient murmur in her mind, steadied her. "Look at the bones, Alara. Always check the bones first." She shifted the heavy transit on her shoulder and began her survey. She moved with a methodical grace, her eyes scanning not for what was lost, but for what remained. The bunkhouse was a loss, the smithy a pile of charred timber. But the assay office, built of stout, hand-hewn stone, was largely intact. Its roof was a sieve of missing shingles, and its windows were vacant eyes. But the walls were plumb, and the foundation was solid. It was a start. It was shelter. She spent the rest of the day clearing a corner of the office, sweeping away decades of accumulated dirt, leaves, and the detritus of nesting animals. She patched the worst of the holes in the roof with salvaged planks and canvas from her pack. As dusk bled across the sky, painting the mountains in hues of violet and rose, she built a small, careful fire in the great stone hearth. The first spark, catching on the tinder she had gathered, felt like a defiant act. She was not a victim. She was a survivor. For a week she worked from dawn until dusk, her world shrinking to the simple, satisfying loop of labor and rest. She cleared the assay office completely, repaired the broken window frames, and began the slow process of chinking the gaps between the foundation stones. She found a spring-fed cistern behind the building, the water clear and cold. Her body ached, but her mind grew quiet. The rhythm of the work, the sheer physical reality of it, was a balm. It was on the 8th day that she turned her attention to the headframe. It was a magnificent, terrifying structure, a cathedral of industrial decay. She spent hours just looking at it, tracing the lines of force and tension, assessing the rot in the massive timbers and the corrosion on the iron fittings. At its heart was the winch mechanism, a colossal assembly of gears and drums that had once lifted tons of ore from the earth's guts. And there, frozen at the top of the shaft, hung the elevator cage, its iron door rusted shut. It had sat there for 80 years, a silent, empty promise. As she meticulously inspected the machinery, her fingers tracing the frozen gears, she saw it. The anomaly. The main brake housing was a massive, cast-iron behemoth, its surface a uniform crust of orange rust, dozens of huge steel bolts, each as thick as her wrist, held it together. All were corroded, fused to the housing by time and weather. All but one. Tucked away on the underside of the assembly, partially obscured by a tangle of snapped cable, was a single, large retaining bolt that gleamed with a soft, dull luster. It was not steel, it was bronze, and it was clean, almost polished, showing no sign of the decay that consumed everything around it. A single point of meticulous order in a universe of chaos. Her grandfather's lessons flooded back. Nature is logical, but man is not. Look for the thing that doesn't belong. That's where the story is. This bolt did not belong. It was too clean, too deliberate. It was a secret, hiding in plain sight. Her heart began to beat a little faster. This was not a repair. This was a message. Getting to it was a challenge. She had to rig a block and tackle to hoist herself up into the greasy, dark heart of the machine. The air was thick with the smell of rust and old oil. Suspended 10 feet above the floor, she began to work on the bolt. It was not threaded like the others. It had a hexagonal head, but her wrenches wouldn't budge it. It was, she realized after careful examination, a locking pin, held in place by an internal mechanism. Using a fine-tipped punch and a small hammer, she began to tap gently around its collar, listening to the sound, feeling for the faintest vibration. Hours passed. The sun arced across the sky, its light filtering through the broken slats of the headframe roof, creating a cathedral of shifting dust motes. Her arms ached. Her fingers were raw, but she worked with the patient, focused intensity of a watchmaker. Then she felt it. A subtle shift. A click so faint it was more a feeling than a sound. The bronze pin moved a fraction of an inch. With a final, careful tap, it slid free into her hand. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low groan of protesting metal, a section of the cast iron housing, a perfectly cut panel she hadn't even seen, swung inward on a hidden hinge. Inside the dark cavity, her shaking flashlight beam found 2 objects. The first was a heavy package wrapped in oilskin and tied with tarred rope. The second was a tin document box, its edges sealed with wax. She lowered herself to the ground, her knees weak with a mixture of exhaustion and adrenaline. She carried her discovery back to the assay office as if it were a holy relic. By the light of her fire, she carefully unwrapped the oilskin package. Her breath caught in her throat. Stacked inside were gold coins. Not a handful, but dozens of them, heavy and lustrous, gleaming in the firelight. It was a fortune, more money than she had ever imagined. It was survival. It was a future. But it was the second object that held the real treasure. She broke the wax seal on the tin box and lifted the lid. Inside, protected from the elements, was a thick, leather-bound journal. The first page was dated 80 years prior. The handwriting was strong and clear. The ink faded, but perfectly legible. "My name is Silas Kane," it began. "And if you are reading this, it means you have a true eye and a steady hand. It means you are not a fool. And it means my work was not in vain." She read for hours, the fire burning down to glowing embers as Silas's story unfolded. He had been an engineer, much like her grandfather, a man who loved the clean logic of machines and the honest truth of geology. The Silent Sentinel had been his life's work. He had found a vein of gold so rich it was the stuff of legend. But his partner, a man of greed and deceit, had conspired to steal it all. He had planned to take the final, massive shipment of ore, then dynamite the main shaft, trapping Silas below to be forgotten. But Silas had been smarter. He had discovered the plot. On the last day, he sent the gold up in the elevator, but instead of ore, it was the refined coins themselves, packed in crates. Then, using a secret mechanism he had built into the winch, the bronze pin, he locked the elevator at the surface, ensuring his partner couldn't bring it down or access the payload. He triggered a smaller collapse in a secondary tunnel to make it look like his own plan had backfired, and then, using a hidden ventilation shaft as an escape route, He had vanished into the mountains, leaving his partner with a worthless, sealed-off mine. The world had branded him a thief, a swindler who had salted his own mine and fled. His name was a curse in the local lore. The journal was his testament, a bitter, lonely account of betrayal and stolen legacy. "I could not stay to claim what was mine," he wrote on the final page. "My name is Mud, and my life is forfeit in this county. But I leave this place and its treasure to the one who finds it. I ask only two things. Do not let this place die, and tell the world the truth of what happened here. Let my name be cleared. The rest is yours. Build a life here. Find the peace that was stolen from me." Tears, hot and unexpected, traced paths through the grime on Alara's cheeks. She was not crying for herself, but for this ghost, this kindred spirit who reached out to her across 80 years of solitude. His story of betrayal mirrored her own quiet expulsion. His legacy of competence was the same one her grandfather had given her. She was not just the mine's owner, she was its heir. The hollow space inside her filled with a profound sense of purpose. The gold changed everything, and it changed nothing. The next morning, she woke not with a plan to leave, but with a blueprint to stay. The money was a tool, like any other in her satchel. It would allow her to buy materials, to hire help where needed, but the work itself, the slow, methodical restoration of the silent sentinel, would still be hers. Her despair had been replaced by a deep, quiet determination. She was no longer just surviving, she was building. Her first project was her home. She traveled back to Terminus, not as a desperate girl, but as a woman with a purpose. She bought lumber, roofing tar, panes of glass, and a cast-iron stove. The clerk, Henderson, watched her load the supplies onto a hired freight wagon, his expression a mixture of pity and disbelief. He still saw her as a fool, just a fool with a little more money to waste. The work on the assay office was deeply satisfying. She repaired the roof, making it watertight and strong. She glazed the windows, letting the bright, clear mountain light flood the stone interior. She re-chinked every stone, laid a new floor of smooth, planed wood, and installed the stove, its warmth a living presence in the small cabin. It was no longer a shelter, it was a home, built with her own two hands. Her regular trips to town began to attract notice. She was a curiosity, the strange young woman who had bought the Kane Folly. Most kept their distance, but a few watched her with a different kind of eye. One of them was Jebediah, the town blacksmith. He was a mountain of a man with a beard like iron filings and hands that could bend steel. He said little, communicating mostly in grunts and nods. He had watched her one day as she selected an axe handle at the general store, running her hand over the grain, checking its balance. He saw that she knew what she was looking for. Her first real test came when she began work on the headframe winch. A key gear in the drivetrain had several teeth sheared off. It was a complex piece of casting, beyond her ability to repair alone. She drew up a detailed schematic of the gear, with precise measurements and notes on the temper of the steel, and took it, along with the broken part, to Jebediah's smithy. He looked at the heavy, grease-caked gear, then at her meticulous drawing. He grunted, a sound of grudging respect. "Where'd a girl like you learn to draft like this?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "My grandfather," she said simply. He studied the drawing again, then looked at her hands, noting the calluses. "This is a week's work," he said. "Cost you?" "I can pay," she said. He shook his head. "Don't want your money. I've got a spring on my property up the North Ridge. Been meaning to map its source and flow rate to see if I can run a pipe down to the forge. You do that for me and I'll reforge this gear." It was a trade, skill for skill. It was an offer of respect, not charity. It was the first crack in the wall of her solitude. "Deal," she said. They shook on it, his massive hand swallowing hers. The grip was firm, a contract between two people who understood the value of real work. Her second ally was Martha, the woman who ran the general store. She was the town's practical, no-nonsense matriarch. She had watched Alara from the beginning, noting the quality of her purchases, the quiet efficiency of her movements. She saw the girl's resilience and recognized a kindred spirit. One day, as Alara was buying provisions, Martha pushed a crate of canned goods across the counter. "Winter comes early in these mountains," she said. "Pay me when you can." It was an extension of credit, but also an extension of faith. The last piece of the small community she was unknowingly building was a man named Cole. He was an old prospector, his face a roadmap of wrinkles carved by sun and time. He was the town's unofficial historian, the keeper of its myths and legends. He found her one afternoon at the mine, where she was carefully replacing a rotten timber in the headframe. He had come to warn her away, to tell her the old stories of the Cain curse. He watched her for nearly an hour as she worked, impressed by her precision, the economy of her movements. She used a plumb bob, a small, heavy brass one that looked impossibly old, to ensure the new beam was perfectly true. He finally spoke, his voice raspy. "That's Elias Vance's plumb bob," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. Alara turned, surprised. "You knew my grandfather?" Cole nodded slowly. "Met him once, 30 years ago. He was surveying for a timber company up here. Best damn surveyor I ever saw. Said he had a granddaughter he was teaching the trade to." His eyes, pale and sharp, held a new light. He was no longer looking at a foolish girl, but at Elias Vance's legacy. He put aside his warnings and instead began to share his knowledge, telling her about the specific geology of the Sentinel Mountain, the hidden water tables, the patterns of the weather. He became her guide to the landscape, just as Jebediah was her guide to steel, and Martha her guide to survival. The minor antagonist, the clerk Henderson, met his quiet defeat in the autumn. He drove out to the mine, some petty bureaucratic errand his excuse, but his real purpose was to see the failure he had predicted. He found Alara directing a small crew, Jebediah and 2 of his hired hands, as they used a complex system of winches and levers to reseat the main axle of the elevator drum. The assay office stood solid and welcoming, a curl of smoke rising from its chimney. The headframe was no longer a skeleton, but a work in progress, its new timbers a pale gold against the old, dark wood. Henderson stood there, his mouth slightly agape, the condescending words dying on his lips. He saw the easy camaraderie between Alara and the blacksmith, the deep respect in the old prospector's eyes as he watched her work. She had not just bought a ruin, she had claimed it, and in doing so, had earned a place in this hard, unforgiving country. He got back in his car and left without a word. The true test came with the first snow. It was not a gentle dusting, but a sudden, violent blizzard that descended from the peaks with the fury of a predator. The mountains simply vanished behind a wall of white. The wind shrieked, piling snow into monstrous drifts. Terminus was cut off. The power failed. The storm was a monster, far worse than anything the old-timers could remember. Alara was prepared. Her larder was full, her woodpile high. The stone assay office, her cozy fortress, barely trembled in the gale. On the second night of the storm, through the howling of the wind, she heard a new sound, a desperate, human shout. She pulled on her heaviest coat, lit a storm lantern, and stepped out into the maelstrom. Guided by the faint cries, she found them less than a quarter-mile down the trail. A family of 4, their truck buried in a drift, the parents trying to shield their 2 small children from the biting wind. She led them back to her cabin. Inside, the warmth and light were a shock after the raging dark. She gave them hot soup and blankets, her small home becoming a sanctuary. They were travelers, caught unawares by the storm's ferocity. For 3 days, as the blizzard raged, the silent Sentinel Mine, once a place of ruin and desolation, was a haven of life and safety. When the storm finally broke, the world was a pristine, silent expanse of white. Jebediah and Cole, leading a small party on snowshoes, were the first to break through. They had come looking for the stranded family, fearing the worst. They found them safe, warm and well-fed in Alara's cabin. In that moment, Alara's place in the community was cemented. She was no longer the outsider who had bought the old Kane place. She was a part of the mountain, a source of strength, her competence a form of salvation for others, as it had been for herself. With the coming of spring, she fulfilled her promise to the ghost who had become her benefactor. She took his journal and a portion of the gold to the state capitol. She hired a historian to authenticate the journal and a lawyer to petition the county. The story of Silas Kane, the brilliant engineer betrayed and wrongly accused, was published in the state's historical quarterly. His name was officially cleared. The Kane curse was replaced by the Kane legend, and the Silent Sentinel became a place of local pride, a story of justice finally served. Alara was its steward. 2 years after she had first walked up that trail, the mine was transformed. She had not reopened it on an industrial scale, but had made it a small, functional operation, a testament to its builder's genius. The elevator, its machinery meticulously restored, now slid smoothly and silently down into the earth. The assay office was a proper home, with a small garden and a porch that looked out over the valley. One evening, as the last light of the sun set the peaks ablaze, she sat on that porch. The air was cool and smelled of pine and damp earth. She was cleaning her grandfather's brass transit, its metal warm from the day's work. Its familiar weight in her hands was a comfort, a connection to the man who had given her the tools to build this life. On the small table beside her, next to the transit, sat a perfect, water-clear quartz crystal, the first thing she had brought up from the mine when the elevator finally descended. It was a piece of Silas Kane's legacy. Her two inheritances, one of skill and one of purpose, sat side by side, united in the quiet evening light. She looked out at the vast, peaceful wilderness that was her home. The insulting $350 from Marcus, a sum meant to signify her worthlessness, had been the purchase price of her entire world. But she knew the true inheritance had never been the money, not Marcus's pittance, nor Silas's fortune. It had been the knowledge in her head and the skill in her hands, bequeathed by a grandfather's love. It had been the kinship she felt with a lonely ghost, a shared story of resilience. It had been the community she had forged, not with words or social graces, but through the universal language of quiet, honest work. The small sum she had paid for a pile of rust and rotten wood had bought her more than a home. It had bought her a life. It was, without a doubt, the best money she had ever spent.